I mean, it's pretty gruesome to hear, but he went to a basketball court and had somebody tie him up on it so he was like a crucifix on the basketball hoop. And then he got treated for the mania, and he got depressed. But then when he kind of came back from those mood episodes, his thinking was always fairly delusional. So it's as though he had like a schizophrenia-like disorder with mood episodes on top of that, and when the mood episode stopped, he still had a lot of thinking disorder. So that's one of the definitions of schizoaffective disorder, kind of like the worst of schizophrenia and the worst of bipolar disorder in the same person, right? There are other forms of schizoaffective disorder when we can't really tell the difference whether it's schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So it's a very important and a very serious disorder that's not very well defined. So that's the quick answer there. Who else? Way back. No, it's 40% of the 50%, 20% overall. So 50% rate of attempt, that's sort of the high-end estimate. And of that group, 4 out of 10, so 40% of the 50, but 20% of the 100%, will make an attempt so serious that they actually complete the suicide. So it's pretty legal. Question here. Of somebody in a rapid cycling manic. Well, it depends on the day. Maybe you catch me on a day where I'm kind of in between episodes. But then I start to go into that hypomania pretty quickly, and I'm kind of amped up, and you're my workmate, and you think, God, is he hyper today? Has he been taking speed? And why are the phone calls coming to the boss at 3 in the morning? And then a month later, the person's not coming into work, and they worry if the person's alive or not, and has been sleeping in his bed in his apartment for 3 days. That's what bipolar disorder looks like. It's really erratic. If we knew that, we could really prevent. Is it a clock that's gone wrong? Is it life stressor events? I mean, some people have rapid cycling where every 2 days they're manic and every 2 days they're depressed for 20 years. You got to think there's a circadian rhythm off. In other people, maybe it's the way they interpret something and they've got the genetic vulnerability that kind of pushes them into a depression or mania. Right here. So what if I don't have any risk genes for bipolar disorder? Once we figure out what those are, it'll be easier to know this. And I am under a whole lot of life stress. Could I develop bipolar disorder? The thinking is you might develop PTSD, you might get depressed, but unless you have the genetic vulnerability, you won't develop bipolar disorder. That's how terrible it's thought to be. But we don't know that because we can't randomly assign people with a certain genotype under certain life stresses, right? Yeah, right here. So I missed the third word. What's the effect of what on bipolar? Weed? So what if you're pretty amped up, you're pretty manic? You might tend to drink to calm that down. Or you might say, holy shit, I could do better with speed. Or maybe weed would really make me feel more sensuous. And when you add chemicals into your brain that are mimicking dopamine agonists, and they're also affecting cannabinoid receptors, it's going to muck things up so we can't tell what's the disorder and what's the drug. It makes things really confusing. And it's called self-medicating, but it's probably actually self-worsening the disorder. Okay, we're going to talk about kids. What did everybody in clinical psychology and psychiatry know until about 1996? Kids can't get bipolar disorder. Maybe 15 or 16 is the earliest. Certainly by 18, 19, certainly in the 20s. But then people started to say almost 20 years ago, there's some kids with ADHD who aren't just fidgeting in class, but they're really impulsive. And they're maybe telling other kids that their teacher's so stupid the teacher ought to be done away with. Well, is that just really impulsive ADHD, or is there kind of a mood disorder underlying that? Is there kind of either a depression or even a bipolar current there? What about the middle school kid who is smarter than my damn algebra teacher in period 1 and then is feeling suicidal in English class period 2? That's not just rapid cycling, that's ultra rapid cycling. You're going to have depressions and manias within a day. So clinicians began to say, maybe in fact, bipolar disorder can develop before the middle of the teen years, but if it does, maybe it looks different from the classic adult forms. What would you look for if a condition is as heritable as bipolar disorder is? What about mom and dad? What about grandma and grandpa? What about aunts and uncles and cousins? If you see this kid and dad was clearly manic and grandmother committed suicide and 2 uncles have been in mental hospitals, then you start to think, wow, there's a lot of depression and some bipolar disorder in the family history. We don't know what the genes are being transmitted, but now we begin to get worried. So by about 20 years ago, a lot of people began to say, is it really the case that you have your first episode at 17 and you haven't had any hint before that? Maybe there's signs in childhood. If kids really have an early form of bipolar disorder, how similar does it look to that of adults, or how different does it look? And are we just talking about kids with ADHD who are comorbid for ODD or depression, or is there really a category of bipolar in kids? So those very rapid cycles, is that a kid who's just impulsive, or are they really having several episodes within a day? Some people by the late 90s began to say, especially in the Boston area, in fact, about 1 in 5 kids with ADHD actually has bipolar disorder. Those symptoms of fidgeting and squirming and impulsivity and blowing out the birthday candles when it wasn't your birthday, those are really manic symptoms. So all of a sudden, people were starting to say, bipolar disorder doesn't have a 0% prevalence in kids, but it's a fifth of all kids with ADHD, and ADHD might exist in 5 to 10% of kids. The prevalence of bipolar in kids is just as high as it is in adults, but maybe it looks different. So that's the controversy. How do you tell a kid who's really acting up and acting out in class, really impulsive, pretty aggressive, ADD plus a conduct disorder, how do you know if that kid really has bipolar disorder? Studies that have been done trying to distinguish look at 2 kinds of symptoms. Number 1, is the kid not just impulsive and squirmy and fidgety, but really grandiose? Does the kid really think, I am friggin' smarter than all my teachers? That's pretty grandiose. I mean, some genius kids might be smarter than some teachers. But if a kid really believes that, that feels more like a manic symptom than just an ADHD symptom. What's the problem here? What do most 4 and 5-year-olds believe, especially boys? They're superheroes. They have superpowers. So how do you know what's sort of the normal development of fantasy in kids? It'd be hard to diagnose mania in a 4-year-old. But by 8 and 9, if you pretty consistently believe you're on top of the world, that may be a symptom that distinguishes ADHD from mania. Number 2, there's a subset of kids who act really sexually provocatively. And that's a symptom of mania in adolescence and adulthood. So that's a symptom that might tip you off too. But what is that also a symptom of? 3 lectures ago, maltreatment. So a kid who's acting very sexually precocious might be showing early signs of mania or might have been sexually abused. So this is where you've got to really get a thorough history to start to tease things apart. What happened was, in a very brief history, by about 2000 to 2005, about 10 years ago, people said, oh my God, we've been missing the boat. Remember, we didn't think depression existed in kids back in the 60s. Now we know that depression does. We didn't think that bipolar existed in kids. Now it does. It might be 2 or 3% prevalence. And in fact, We thought you had ADHD before, and we gave you stimulants. What do stimulants do? They stimulate dopamine. The last thing you want to do for somebody with bipolar disorder. So kids were pulled off stimulants and given pretty heavy-duty mood-stabilizing and antipsychotic medications. Things really came to a head in 2007-8 in Massachusetts when a 4-year-old foster kid who'd been clearly traumatized, multiple foster homes. At age 4, the parents overdosed the kid on antipsychotic medications, and the kid died of a medication overdose. Did that kid really at age 4 have bipolar disorder, or was this just a convenient label for a kid who'd been maltreated and placed in multiple foster homes with a pretty crazy foster family? So we went from there's no kids with bipolar to maybe 3% of all kids have bipolar, and if they do, we can't treat them with ADHD medications. And so the way a lot of social history goes, we went from nothing to kind of everything, and maybe now we're in a period of trying to sort this out. So how do we sort this out? I had dinner last week with Ellen Liebenluft, who was in town giving grand rounds at UC San Francisco, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And 10 years ago, she said, we've got to make some sense of all this. So she said, well, how do we really think about bipolar disorder in kids? Well, below the age of 15, there's a very small percentage of kids who look pretty much like adults with bipolar disorder. They have real manias, and then they have real depressions, often periods of normal mood in between, sometimes mixed states. That's way under 1% of kids. That's the narrow adult definition. But then we've got to maybe consider something intermediate. Number 2, so if number 1 is this narrow phenotype, maybe there are some kids who look like they've got mania, but the mania's only last a day or 2. But you can't meet criteria for bipolar disorder, because remember it says 7 days. And it turns out that kids who are manic for a day or 2 end up looking like adults with bipolar disorder. The second intermediate category, so number 3 from the top, what about kids who are extremely irritable? Anything pisses them off. If you've worked with kids or if you have little brothers and sisters, you know what it's like to have an irritable younger sibling. It's no fun. But what if a kid is like looking for a fight all the time, and you say, oh, could you just please put away the dishes? Don't tell me what to do, damn it. Kids are like picking a chip on their shoulder. It turns out that many adults with mania don't necessarily get grandiose. They're irritable a lot. And kids, Liebenluft says, with mania, may be very susceptible to express their mania mainly through irritability, not through grandiosity or euphoria. So the second intermediate category or phenotype is kids with manic episodes, but they're usually not diagnosed as manic because why? Because they're not thinking they're on top of the world. They're just pissed off all the time. It turns out that kids with manias characterized by irritability end up looking a lot like adults with bipolar disorder. Then what about the broad category, number 4? Kids who don't really cycle, kids who've got a lot of ADHD symptoms, and they're explosive and angry, but you can't really tell that there's been a depression or a mania. So this was 10, 15 years ago, a group that people said, oh my God, they must have bipolar disorder. These kids ended up getting called severe mood dysregulation. It turns out that those kids, many of whom suddenly got diagnosed with bipolar disorder, as they grow up, don't look anything like adults with bipolar disorder. So the moral of the story is, a tiny group of kids look like adults with bipolar disorder. There's 2 subcategories of kids that we probably ought to relax the criteria. We say, if you've got a very short mania, that's a problem for a kid. If you've got a really irritable mania, that's a problem for a kid. But chronically explosive kids, that you'd really have to stretch the definition of bipolar disorder to say they have bipolar disorder, those kids have problems. They've got ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder. But to say they have bipolar disorder and stop their ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder treatments is probably doing them a big disservice. They probably really don't have bipolar disorder. That make sense? Trying to figure out what's what. Question here. Well, so now DSM-5 has tried to invent a kind of new category that I'm not going to emphasize. For a while it was called temper regulation disorder, but then they thought that sounds like temper tantrums. DSM-5 doesn't know what to do with this group. You don't want to call them just having ADHD or ODD. You don't want to say they're bipolar disorder. It's kind of a provisional category of explosive mood, and we're going to try to figure out by DSM-6 where they belong. Question? Severe mood dysregulation responds really well to treatments for coercive parenting and classroom management, the ADHD and conduct disorder treatments. Yeah, it's kind of like you're chronically irritable, but it's not a distinct period of mood. Bipolar disorder is saying you've got distinct periods of moods where you're pretty different from your usual mood, as opposed to a kid who's chronically ornery. Okay? Question here again. What's the difference between that and ODD? There's a certain explosiveness to this that you don't find in most kids with ODD. Does that sound subjective? Yeah, it is. That's the problem, right? So what are you going to do for a kid who really has bipolar disorder? If they really have bipolar disorder, you probably need to give them medications to prevent suicide and to prevent depressions later on. But what if a kid really seems like they're not focused very well, they're distractible, inattentive, and impulsive, and they've got these bipolar symptoms? You probably need to keep up the ADHD treatments and add the mood-stabilizing treatments, so you're treating both. The problem with medicating kids for bipolar disorder is there's hardly any controlled studies. So when 15 years ago we started saying all these kids had bipolar disorder, pulling them off stimulants, pulling them out of parent training, and giving them heavy-duty antipsychotic and mood-stabilizing medications, we didn't know what the side effects are. And what are the main side effects of the second-generation antipsychotic meds? Weight gain, type 2 diabetes. So a lot of kids get obese, and there's an obesity epidemic anyway, so it's a big issue. Mary Freistad, our colleague at Ohio State, has developed the nation's first psychosocial family group program for families of kids who really have bipolar disorder. So it's a lot of ADHD stuff, no coercive parenting, but also trying to get families to understand that their kid has a mood disorder, why they need medications. We need a lot more treatments like this. So how many kids really have bipolar disorder? If you apply the diagnostic criteria that you would for an adult, it's way under 1%. If you apply those kind of intermediate groups, maybe it's 1% of kids. If you say, oh my God, any kid who's chronically irritable, severe mood dysregulation has bipolar disorder, then it's going to be 5+% of kids, but that's probably not the right way to do it. So we're almost out of time, but let's do a little case study here. So you run a clinic. You've taken Psych 131, you go to grad school, you go to med school, and you're in the community running a mental health center, and a 10-year-old comes in. This 10-year-old, let's say it's a boy, because it's more typical for girls 10 and up to have depression. Boy has very serious depression, and both parents have had major depressions. One grandparent committed suicide, and several aunts and uncles seem to be kind of dysthymic.